And we really believe that there can be some cultural damage caused by the intervention. Yes, but it is the only way. It is the only way of stopping Assad from killing many more people and promoting an endless civil war. I can take your point now.
So when there's not enough practical considerations, intervention cannot be completed in the long run. Your civilians suffer under hell.
I really don't see your point, sir.
When you do not consider the practical costs of the war, intervention cannot be completed.
As I said, we need to intervene to stop a long-term civil war. We've also heard from the first speaker that there is an organic opposition and they will do it themselves somehow. And from the second speaker of opposition, we heard that there's no opposition and we have nobody to help. So we really don't see how this should was their position. So we really believe that it is our moral responsibility, and where we have the money has nothing to do with that. And for example, we follow this moral obligation in the case of Libya. So, where the economic crisis was on its deepest point, and now we are already out of the crisis. So there's no reason why we should not intervene in Syria.
Sir,
yes, sir.
After February, the EU couldn't even stitch together a fiscal discipline plan, and countries like the UK walked out. How are you going to have the political impetus to go into a war now?
Are you comparing the cost of a war in Syria to the cost of the European national GDP?
Yes.
Well, that doesn't make sense. It's like absolutely different numbers, like million times bigger numbers. Now, as I said before, it's really important that the unilaterality is not questioned whether it is possible to have all the or whether all the states agree on the motion, but where they should have agreed. And we believe they should, as I've explained before. And this wasn't really tackled by the side of opposition today. They actually agreed that we should do something about the situation and that we should stop the bloodshed, but haven't showed us how the current way of dealing with the problem will somehow start to work. Or would it, sir?
Sir, tell us, how is your military intervention saving lives when you will fuel sectarian violence which will result in more bloodshed?
Well, we will stop the civil war and give the people a chance to help decide for themselves and to make their own government, as it happened in Libya. And in Libya, actually stop the civil war, and there is no more bloodshed today. Now, to discuss the sovereignty of Assad regime, as I said before, and as the UN conventions also say, when the regime fails to protect its citizens, it really it is the responsibility falls to the other nations. So the sovereignty isn't in question. The sovereignty of the regime falls, and also the people support the rebels. So we don't really see how this is the intervention would somehow attack the people's sovereignty when they are against the regime. Now, moving on to the feasibility of the intervention, which really isn't as important, but let's describe that anyway. Basically, we've heard that we don't have the money, which I have described before. We didn't hear anything about in the second speech we proposed the way how we do that with the base of Cyprus and the Arab helping our intervention. So they've been saying so that there's somehow a problem with the intervention, but they didn't really show us why or how this wouldn't work. And so we've heard that the intervention would somehow harm our position, as make us a colonialist or something. But we believe that when we stand for the human rights and when we've intervened in Libya, it would really make our position inconsistent and harm our position, because we can't say that Templars protect human rights when we don't that do ourselves. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your speech. Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe the road to hell isn't paved with good intentions. Maybe those intentions in themselves are wrong as well. Because at the end of the day, we've actually given you a principled analysis in this debate about the aspirations and the self-determination of the Syrian people and why morally it is unjustified to infringe on that. They haven't dealt with it. But we also told you that morals and principles need to be supported by some kind of practical basis, some kind of practical ground-up approach. Because if you don't have the practicalities, those very principles that you want to achieve aren't going to be achieved. You're going to get the opposite effect. More people are going to die, the very people that you morally want to protect. We told you why, and they haven't responded to it. So we're going to tell you on two reasons why we take today's debate. Firstly, on the principled idea of a moral obligation, and I put that first because they accuse us of not talking about it. And secondly, on the idea of why EU is practically not the best placed organization to do it. So let's delve right into the principles of a moral obligation. Now, they say that there's a moral obligation to uphold human life and respect human rights. Now, we've already considered from the beginning, human rights are an amazing thing. They're universal. We believe that we need to protect human rights. What we need to talk about now is what is the best way to do that? What is the most principled, justified way to do that? So let's talk about whether intervention is the best way, because that's what they've been debating for. We don't think intervention is going to be morally the best way because it leads to an escalation of violence, especially when this violence is happening in areas which are urbanized, in areas which are cities where people are living in residential areas. It is not a battleground where there are going to be lines drawn in the sand and you have two opposing armies. You're going to have bombs falling on cities like Homs, like Ramah, like Idlib, and like Damascus. We think more people die, and morally, that's reprehensible. But even more than that, we see that the EU doesn't really have a great track record of being able to distinguish between government forces and non-government forces. We've told you this since our second speaker, and we see a precedent of this when NATO forces in Taliban have been shooting at Pashtuns even though they weren't Taliban fighters. NATO forces in Somalia shooting at civilians who are carrying arms to protect themselves even though they're not Islamic thought terrorists. All these things are going to happen, and that's morally reprehensible because in principle, the same people that they want to protect are going to die. But even more than that, we think that Assad is going to begin to take hostages. The moment his sovereignty is infringed upon and he sees that the international community isn't respecting territorial borders, he's going to begin to use his people as bargaining chips and use their lives as something to prevent further headway for EU forces to move into the country and towards Damascus. We think that that's morally reprehensible because now there isn't the possibility of peace, but there's a certainty of massacre. We don't think that EU forces are going to be able to get there quick enough to protect them. We don't think they're going to be coordinated enough to ensure that all these deaths don't happen. We think in principle and morally, that is reprehensible. No thank you, sir. In fact, we think that Assad is so coldly calculative that he's going to allow his country to implode to protect himself. And only things like diplomacy and sanctions are going to bring about a stable transitionary platform for a new government to take place. Which is why things like Kofi Annan's ceasefire holding after sanctions are a great thing. And we see that this is something which is true, and I'm going to give you further analysis of that. Assad has also made concessions to allow in inspectors from the Red Cross to tend to wounded people and wounded civilians. He's also allowed 250 inspectors from the United Nations to enter and observe the conditions within Syria. All of these have happened within the last week, ladies and gentlemen. We think that diplomacy is going fine. But then we also don't think that intervention is the best way to do it because principally it's going to be a piecemeal effort which is going to lead to more people dying as well. Precisely because of the lack of resources and the internal bureaucracy within the European Parliament, which is going to have to overrule individual countries, politicians and parliaments. The EU isn't going to be able to have a coordinated military effort. We see that, as I pointed out in my POI, hold on a moment, sir, if they can't even pass a fiscal discipline plan and key countries like the UK are walking out, UK, by the way, being one of the key military contributors to NATO, they're never going to be able to coordinate any kind of military operation or campaign in Syria. That's only going to lead to more people dying, that's only going to lead to more deaths. That's principally and morally reprehensible.
But shouldn't they?
Shouldn't they?
Yeah.
So we don't think they should, precisely because you are talking about morally more people dying. And we are telling you right now, and as I'm proving to you, more people are going to die. That's why they shouldn't. And even more than that, as I move on to my second question, later on I'm going to tell you why they cannot. But let me move on to even more about these highfalutin principles of human rights. Now, even if human rights could be achieved this way, we think that human rights in the long term are only going to be respected if they are achieved organically. Because if you fall back into chaos after a military intervention, like what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan, the sovereignty and the aspirations of the people to choose, the very principle that both sides are fighting for, isn't going to be achieved. What's going to happen in Syria is that because now there's no organic opposition, the Syrian National Council just imploded 2 weeks ago. It's not like Egypt. There's going to be sectarian splits. And so what's going to happen is that in spite of the fact that the Syrian people haven't called for intervention, you're going to be infringing upon what they have chosen and what they want for their own future. We think that that's morally abhorrent, and we think that they're not going to have the kind of elections that they want because it's going to fall into chaos. So number one, either the EU is going to have to hold the hands of a Syrian party and bring them through an entire election, which means number one, there isn't going to be any legitimacy to that election because the Syrian people aren't really going to be able to choose because the EU is going to sponsor it, or the EU is going to step back and say, hey, you guys choose, but it's going to lead to chaos because of the sectarian violence which is occurring within the country. So this entire principle of the Syrian people being able to choose the future they want, which has been our principle from the beginning, doesn't stand in their case. It only stands in ours when we allow a grassroots movement to take hold and we allow the Syrian opposition to move forward itself. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, the EU shouldn't go in. Now moving on to why the EU cannot, because that is as crucial as the principal justification for whether it should or not. Now they've talked about how EU's military technology is good. Now we think that overwhelming force is ultimately, in the eyes of the Arabs, disproportionate. It's perceived as neo-colonialism. Because every time a Western country goes in with its Western military and its tanks, and it rolls in on an inferior Arab military, it's perceived as being overbearing. And that's what empowers radicalism. Hold on a moment, sir. That's what empowers terrorist rhetoric. Go ahead.
Before Lordship, I was going to explain that the intervention in Libya was successful. Now we have a peaceful situation.
I'm sorry, sir. The National Transition Council is having to fight off Islamist jihadists every single day. Libya wasn't as successful as you think. In fact, if you see the newspapers, again, we're seeing that Libya is having trouble and there are calls for Libya actually possibly even failing in terms of the latest government, which has been set up by the NTC and Muhammad Jibril. So we don't think that that's something that falls to your side. But we think that the new regime, even if it materializes, because it doesn't look like it's going to materialize now with no solid opposition leadership, isn't going to go along with any EU rebuilding efforts. Because it's going to have to be forced to fall back to popular sentiment, which doesn't want it to be associated with a Western imposition and Western military rolling in and killing its fellow Arabs. In fact, we think that even then, we think that casualties, there aren't going to be casualties only for the Syrians, but for the EU as well. Because if you look at it, if Assad's government and Assad's army is really that well organized and that well distinct as they argue, then surely they are going to fight for the end. We don't think the EU is going to have the political will to finish the job if it's having its own blood being spilled in a foreign Middle Eastern country. That's only going to lead to piecemeal efforts like what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Libya, and eventually the regime is going to collapse. So at the end of the day, it isn't just about practicalities. We've shown you why those practicalities don't work and that you can't do it. But it's also about principles. And if you think about who best saves the lives of the Syrian people and ensures they have a future that they choose and not anyone else, it's clearly side opposition.
Okay, so now let me ask Mark Delegate's reply speech.
I'm going to march you down the streets of Homs, Idlib, and Damascus in their road. There were high vaunted principles, because the first substantive, what was carried down the road, was moral need to intervene. We agreed with them. We said, but how can you stand for saving lives, but acknowledge the chilling concession in their first speaker that it was a necessary sacrifice? A necessary sacrifice that innocent civilians on the streets were to die in their case, but while they fundamentally, dogmatically fought for saving lives. And then we asked them, how are they any different from Assad? In fact, we asked, what about the principles of self-determination? How can you impose a change when the people may not want it? Do you want more violent? How do you impose change when people may not want it? People who don't want more violent soldiers on the streets than what they already have. And then they asserted, people simply want intervention. We told them that the realities of socio-political stratification there, when the Shias, the Alawites, and the Jews don't necessarily want intervention, they don't want military intervention, they never came back to us with that. And then we asked them, how can you stand for the people but ignore the fact that a poorly conducted operation and intervention will only hurt the people more? They never understood what we meant by that. They simply said, we fundamentally fight for morals, they never knew what those morals meant. Good intentions were not enough to save the good morals. But then they were impractical. They told us that principles were the most important, and they never cared about practical issues. They claimed in the substantive argument that the European Union were the best suited for it. And we asked them why. They're heavily indebted and they lack the political unity and will. They never clashed with us in political unity and will. They fundamentally conceded that the EU is a broken body. But then they told us, maybe they have enough money. EU always has the money. And we asked them why. They're over $4 trillion in debt. The strongest member of their party, the UK, just walked out on them. The response, they considered that other nations might need to help them out. This was when they fundamentally failed in their one single burden, to prove that the EU should have militarily intervened unilaterally. As much as they like to claim what unilaterally meant, it means that EU needs to do it alone by conceding they need help if you cross the house. But let's look at what happens in our world. We did stand for principles. We stood for the principle of the right to self-determine. We said that the Syrian people were not a dominant people. They had the will, they had the capability, and they had the power. And that's why we stood for helping them up from a ground-up approach rather than imposing the will of a military dictatorship. And then they asked, how do we unfairly protect why do we unfairly protect the illegitimate Assad vote? And we explained to them, we were never unfairly protecting the Assad vote. We were protecting the people. The people had the right to choose. And intervention fundamentally undermined the entire democratic movement. It inflamed sectarian violence because the majority will appear to be more oppressive. They never understood the nuances on the ground. But then we better protected Syrian lives because we recognize the urban setting of Syria, we recognize the guerrilla nature of fighting, we recognize the contextual nuances that they never accepted. And then finally, we looked at long-term EU commitment, what Agrim told them about. And this clashed with that point, that the EU needed to be a force to help the people. And we said the best way for the EU to help was not to send in violent soldiers with guns blazing. And they did. They never had a response. And then we stood for Syria. We gave you a cogent policy with a precedent of success. They told us about Libya. We've told you why Libya isn't what we want to stand for, and even in the best case scenario they could bring out, it wasn't helpful. At the end of the debate, when we walked down the streets of Homs, Damascus, and Idlib, it was the whole of side opposition that the Syrians wanted to hear.
Thank you very much. I will call it on Jan.
Ladies and gentlemen, our side is deeply sorry, and even in the rest, to remind you what the motion reads. The motion reads as follows: that the European Union, not that they could intervene, but that they should have intervened. And ladies and gentlemen, we believe that this is a fundamental thing which we are supposed to prove in this debate. We are not supposed to prove that from a practical point of view that we could have done this, but that we should have done this. So we believe that the center of this debate, and I'm sorry to remind you in my reply speech, the center of this debate is whether from the principal point of view that was supposed to be done, not whether from the very practical point of view we were able at that time to do so. Well, but on the other hand, we as a side were very able to prove you that even from the practical point of view, even though there will be a sacrifice, we will still be able to uphold this resolution and the intervention at the end. Well, in this debate, I have identified three main questions. That was the national sovereignty, then the feasibility of the operation, and then the European crisis, and then the European will be possible to do so. Well, so first, with the national sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, what we've been told by the side of opposition that simply because of the principle which they claim is the most important as national sovereignty, no every intervention is justified. But we explain that we value the lives of people more than the actual national sovereignty. And we have explained that yes, at the first stage of the intervention there might be some collateral damage. But we come up with the example of Libya, where actually gradually since the intervention of the NATO was on place, the National Council was more united, and actually the collateral damage was more and more limited. So that within 1 year, the operation in Libya was successful, and now the government actually, or the people, enjoys freedom, and they can actually choose their government. Well, we've heard that in Libya now they have to fight the jihadists, but ladies and gentlemen, they have never proved us that fighting the jihadists, having some problem with religion, is worse than actually being under the bloodshed of the Gaddafi. We still believe that yes, there will be some hardships after the intervention is done, but yet we believe that this is much more better than having a blood repression from the government actually holding the guns and forcing their people to comply. Well, on top of that, we explained that the national sovereignty mirrors the opinion of people, and we have shown that people are urging the international community. You can see that in news for some action, that people are desperate. And on those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, we have proven that actually the opinion of people or the will of people should mirror the national sovereignty. And since the nation wants some change, and since the nation seeks for freedom, then actually the national sovereignty goes in power of people. And on top of that, even if that was not true, still the lives of an individual are more important, provided that actually, yes, there will be some short-term harms, but long-term benefits. On that, we've been said that it won't be feasible because of the guerrilla warfare. But ladies and gentlemen, I've come in my speech with the example of the Turkish representants in the representatives of Syria now in Turkey promised to more unite the National Council gradually if the intervention will be undertaken. And I've again explained that in Libya, at the very beginning of the intervention, yet the forces were not united as well, but later on, they were actually able to distinguish, and then the operation was finally successful. Well, what we have heard, furthermore, that actually all of this is not necessary anyway, because we have a diplomacy. But we have explained that the ceasefire was not possible, and on that, we have actually justified that the regime is not rational, since even on our first speech we have proven that the numbers of casualties are increasing every month. On those grounds, ladies and gentlemen, since the regime is not rational, and since the bloodshed will continue, we believe it is our obligation, and we have proved it from the principle and even from the practical point of view, that actually we should have done the intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this debate, and we will take about 15 minutes, I guess, and then